Now, in many days gone by, the P5 nations shared many fundamental understandings about strategic deterrence, nuclear risk, and expected standards of behavior. And one of the perhaps more distressing realities of this chapter of the nuclear story is that many of these shared understandings seem to be fading at a foundational level. As technologies that once belonged to the conventional realm begin to have nuclear relevance, the P5 appears to have more things to disagree on, more things to make each other feel less safe and less secure. And a few developments have been more potently divisive in the last few decades than missile defense. And what I hope to do today is explore how and why the nuclear powers, specifically the P5, have divided opinions on this exact issue. And I aim to illustrate that this issue is rooted in a fundamental difference in understanding on the strategic utility and actual implications of missile defense as a technology. Now, as I say, with many of these kind of novel and new technologies, the starting point for these sorts of analysis should actually be to peel back some of the bark and observe what specifically we don't see eye to eye on at the most basic strategic kind of deterrence level. Only then, in my opinion, can we really begin to appreciate where these risks are coming from and from that where we can maybe hope to see some remedy. Now, before I go any further, as is often the case, I'd just like to do a little bit of housekeeping. And the first thing I want to say is that I am here today as an individual presenting my own work and my own takes on a lot of these issues. Despite any affiliations, either current or previous, it's important to acknowledge that what you hear today are indeed my own deductions. Now, the missile defense dilemma is a decades-old issue, and it's by no means new in terms of the questions it raises and the problems that we face. Indeed, I'm sure that many of our colleagues here today may even remember the signing of the original 1972 ABM treaty between Nixon and Brezhnev. And yet it seems strange on this year, what would have been its 50th birthday, we're tackling the exact same issues, dilemmas, and questions that we were 50 years before. At least in the build-up to the ABM treaty, we were able to see eye to eye on the utility and relevance of the technology itself. There were no arguments back then about the utility of accurate and reliable missile defenses for force protection in the conventional sense, and where a missile defense could be understood as an issue in and of itself, and not one of a number of overlapping technologies and different areas, which now suddenly means something for nuclear deterrence like it does today. So in an attempt to demystify today's missile defense picture, my big questions are going to include the following. Where do the P5 nations sit on the missile defense issue? Are they with it? Are they against it? Or is there a more ambiguous position held by some of these actors? Second, what are the theoretical and practical foundations upon which these opinions are drawn? What are the points of divergence between the P5? And what specifically is it in the strategic and maybe theoretical sense we're not actually seeing eye to eye on? Third, what are the ramifications of this divide, both at strategic theory level, but also in practical policy? What are the anxieties and reactions inspired by this dilemma? And what are the risks for the P5 that come from that? And finally, I want to look at what the key barriers are to retaining a shared commitment to risk mitigation. And really, what is stopping us as P5 nations really from making honest and frank progress and having conversations about these risks? But I begin with, well, what I want to begin with is I bring you to what is, for me, the key issue at play here. And it's simply that at the most foundational level, the P5 nations appear to be increasingly at odds with one another with the most basic questions concerning strategic deterrence and also posture and missile defense, and the kind of ways in which those elements connect and whether they can exist mutually or whether they should be considered mutually exclusive. Now, the whole debate is sometimes framed as being simply pro or anti-missile defense, and you'll see that for some countries, particularly the UK and France, they really struggle to fit into that interpretation. Sometimes official rhetoric from those two countries clashes with actual policy behaviour, and this complicates the process of putting these countries on that sort of scale. Now, nuclear strategic theory as itself is a very large field, but in this case, particularly where missile defense is concerned, the key areas of disagreement are effectively threefold, and you can see those at the bottom there. The first is whether a state can possess layered missile defenses and still maintain stable mutual deterrence relationships with its nuclear peers. Taking this further, what we also mean here is whether basically owning missile defense systems degrades deterrence relationships, whether it enhances them, or whether in practical terms it doesn't make any difference at all. Second is the second point of contention is about whether the concerns expressed by the countries on missile defense are actually legitimate. We don't agree on this, and this isn't just at a theoretical level either. This is actually whether, if you pull back and look at the practical implications of missile defense, are the outcries we often see from other P5 nations valid? And like I said, there's no agreement on that. And the third point ties in with that previous issue, and it is, of course, whether the actions taken by countries in the name of readdressing mutual vulnerability are actually warranted. Now, moving forward, you can see here that I have effectively placed the P5 nations on this something of a scale, similar to the one that I mentioned just now, and it focuses on the main point of conflict in the P5, that being a disagreement on whether missile defense technology is compatible and enhances deterrence, as you can see on the left there, or whether it degrades deterrence, as you can see on the right. So taking a look on the left there, we have the Americans, who for them, missile defense has both utility and is also perfectly in line with deterrence logic. You can see in a lot of official documentation, particularly missile defense reviews, that missile defense is seen as enhancing the deterrence position of the United States. It makes what Joseph Alsop called a few decades ago, he referred to something called the aggressor's problem, the difficulty in basically striking your enemy's nuclear weapons. For the Americans, missile defense makes that issue harder. It's an insurance policy for the Americans against rogue states or accidental launches. It allows for the US to project conventional forces via bases or carrier strike groups overseas safely. And it also stops US foreign policy options from being limited because their cities can't be held hostage. Now, the other end of the spectrum, you have China and Russia, who are, particularly Russia, outspoken critics of American efforts to develop layered theater, so shorter range missile defenses, but also national long range missile defenses. For these states, the issue is that the US seems to completely refuse to accept mutual vulnerability as a necessary condition for strategic deterrence. They see the US as effectively buying its way out of mutual vulnerability. And they also claim that despite proclamations by the US that their missile defenses are to protect against North Korea or Iran, that actually, as their systems improve and the ways in which the Americans deploy them, that has knock-on effects for China and Russia's strategic deterrent. Consequently, we see that China and Russia defend developments such as anti-satellite technology or hypersonics because they don't see US missile defense as a defensive technology. And they worry that one day, eventually, the US will be able to conduct disarming attacks against them and absorb any attempt at retaliation with these defenses. As a result, the credibility of China and Russia's deterrent, in theory, is reduced. Now, the positions of the UK and France are a little more confusing. And I want to speak more about that on the next slide. But frankly, neither the UK or France currently tend to engage in these big normative arguments. That's not quite like they used to, nor do they discuss the utility and impact of missile defense in the way that the other powers do. But we'll see in a moment that there are some things about these two countries that do give us an insight into their actual positions. Now, this lack of consensus is rooted in a number of different areas, and I won't go through all of these that you see, but I will mention just a few of the key ones. So for the US position on missile defense, it's quite an interesting overlap. So on the left there, you can see that firstly, it's important to mention that some years ago, the US had a very big conversation with itself about the wars it was likely going to fight in the coming decades. And the countries that they thought they might be up against shared many things. One was that they all had a very strong inclination to use conventional ballistic missiles in their everyday warfighting. If you look at countries like Iran, North Korea, China, Russia, and at the time Iraq, they all grew their stockpiles of conventional ballistic weapons, in some cases for the sole purpose of denying the US access to those certain domains. So for the US, there was a strong conventional imperative for attaining at least theater range ballistic missile defense technology. Second is about threat perception. Now, the US practiced normal deterrence, as we know it, with China and Russia for decades throughout the Cold War. But at the end of the 21st century, after the Cold War, it really began to worry about the threats posed by unreliable, unstable, and kind of third-party nuclear states, particularly North Korea, and if it were to ever attain nuclear weapons, maybe Iran. And whether they felt they couldn't practice deterrence with North Korea or they shouldn't because it would legitimize their regimes, they basically decided that missile defense is an alternative to deterrence, and it could be effectively an insurance policy if relations, either military or diplomatic, with these countries broke down. And the last thing I want to mention for the US is that, generally speaking, the US doesn't actually consider its missile defense assets to represent a threat to countries like China and Russia, who have, as we saw earlier in Timur's presentation, hundreds or thousands of different warheads. And for the Americans, they are basically trying to apply different strategic logics to different actors. And it's very much a case of missile defense for these guys and strategic deterrence for these guys. And for them, that's the price that comes with that is one worth paying. Now, on the right side there, you have China and Russia, and their lack of consensus on this issue draws a lot from those pre-existing ideas about what deterrence is, what it looks like, and what it should be. Again, at the conventional level, missile defense clashes with these two countries because it really interrupts their basic military strategies, particularly China, who is striving to develop a sophisticated anti-access area denial capability. So at the theater level, China and Russia already have a strong reason to dislike missile defenses in the conventional sense. And this brings us to point two, and this is, again, a particularly big issue for Russia, and it's the problem of how American rhetoric about who missile defense is aimed at clashes with what they actually do with it in policy. The case in point here is European missile defense. And you see, since 2009, the US has made a big commitment to NATO and European missile defense, placing sites in Poland and Romania, with the intention of defending, at least at a policy level, defending Europe from threats in the Middle East. And the problem is, if that's the case, and this is the narrative coming out of Moscow, why are those missile defense systems on the Russian border? And why are they being improved, as we know they are, to include things like the SM-3 Block 2, which is a missile which has been demonstrated to intercept ICBMs. Iran, the countries that threaten Europe, allegedly, do not have ICBM capabilities that we're aware of. So why are these systems upgrading to the point that actually they could have implications for not Middle Eastern stockpiles, Russian stockpiles? And then the third issue for the Chinese and the Russians is that is basically the prospect that the US can afford to buy its way out of mutual vulnerability. And this is a serious problem because, generally speaking, it doesn't appear like the Chinese and the Russians can, economically speaking, match that capability. And what this ties into for them is that the US is effectively betraying decades of tried and tested deterrence logic because they feel that they can afford to do that. And there is a gap here that, frankly, the Chinese and Russians are either not willing to fulfill or simply can't. Now, that, of course, brings us to the remaining issue of Britain and France. And here the picture actually looks a lot more complex because they seem to have a mixed, or in some cases outright contradictory, position on missile defense, especially when you look at what they do in policy versus what they say at the statement kind of public policy level. Now, I could go on forever here, but I do want to mention just a couple of things. The first is that the French do have something of a tradition of opposing missile defense. They strongly supported the ABM Treaty in the 1970s. They opposed Reagan's plans for the Strategic Defense Initiative in the 1980s, and have generally considered long-range national missile defenses as actually being a very inefficient way of dealing with the problem of missile proliferation. But what we see, and this applies again to the UK, that there seems to be a new tradition here of general ambivalence, right? And the second thing I want to mention is that I do feel there is something of a European attitude to missile defense that very much sets Britain and France aside from the United States. Now, there's not much of a European political appetite for national missile defense, not to mention we don't have a stomach for paying for one. We are generally more skeptical of the cost-benefit ratio of these systems. Our threat perceptions are different. We don't feel particularly motivated to build missile defenses because we don't feel particularly threatened by any Middle Eastern threats like the Americans apparently do. And frankly, with tight budgets, we would rather spend money protecting deployed forces overseas rather than defending large swathes of national territory. And this brings me to my final point as to why this becomes a bit more complex. And it's because recently British and French attitudes to missile defense haven't been very coherent. For example, the UK, it does a lot of its thinking in private. We aren't very vocal about what we think about missile defense. But something interesting happened last year when we decided to increase the cap on our nuclear weapons. And what it was is our defense secretary effectively went on television and said that one of the motivations for increasing the cap on our nuclear stockpile was because of developments in Russian missile defense technology. Now, what we accidentally done was we told the world that in theory, we think missile defense degrades deterrence. So at a theoretical level, we should be siding with the Chinese and the Russians on this issue. Yet, generally speaking, if you look at policy, we've supported the deployment of European missile defense. So there is a conflation here, or an issue between what we say about missile defense and what we do with missile defense. So we're now brought to the anxieties, reactions, and risks that are created by missile defense issues for the P5. And for the sake of time, because I'm aware we're running low, I won't address everything on this slide, but I will focus on those risks on the right. First, there is, of course, that for some countries, the answer to missile defense is actually proliferation. And this has been apparent, obviously, for the UK, and we now suspect China, where the logic is simply you just build more warheads than the enemy has interceptors, and you then restore mutual vulnerability. Another long-term escalation risk here is from basically policy and planning postures. The issue here comes generally from that countries might identify a need for heightened alert postures, quite aggressive procurement strategies, or different delivery systems as a means of, again, restoring a kind of balance of mutual vulnerability, or potentially denying the US or whoever has these missile defense systems access to them in a conventional conflict. And the final risk for me would be that this overall sort of decline in arms control dialogue, which I'm sure we're all aware of, is actually accelerated in the short to medium term because of the missile defense issue. And because there is a refusal by basically all parties to cede ground on these policy areas, we basically paralyze. And what we do is we tie our hands with any future limitations. And at the bilateral and multilateral level, diplomacy gets just basically a little bit harder. So the last question I want to discuss before we wrap up is what stands in the way of our traditional kind of models for risk mitigation? Now, generally speaking, as I'm sure some of us know, in the Cold War, we had pretty good effective measures for managing risk. But for me now, there are 5 main things preventing us from moving forward here. The first, and this for me is the biggest hurdle, the P5 have, at the most basic level, a fundamental disagreement on the compatibility of missile defense and strategic deterrence. What this does, it prevents us from seeing eye to eye on basically every other problem that comes from this, because we start at completely different places from one another. Second, is that we are now quite firmly in a security dilemma concerning this and indeed other technologies. What we can see now is that the ways in which countries try and compensate for their perceived loss in deterrence through things like hypersonics are actually fueling missile defense developments from people like the USA. And that is a cyclical process, and it happens vice versa. And in the short term, I don't think that's going away. The third is that there is a complete absence of meaningful dialogue on missile defense between the P5. Outside of proclamations and kind of general statements, we are not having conversations, either formally or informally, on a scale that suggests we can start to have to kind of form agreements and understandings on this issue. Fourth, and I consider this actually quite an under-mentioned factor, we're faced with a problem where missile defense technologies are becoming actually central to some countries' conventional warfighting strategies. This is particularly true for the US, and I presented on this back in February with the Pugwash conferences. If you look at the way the US fights wars, it places a lot of value on theater missile defenses for force protection. And this makes risk mitigation harder, because what you're basically asking from the US or any actor that kind of pursues missile defense technology is you're asking them to limit the systems that they consider absolutely vital to normal everyday warfighting. And for the Americans and maybe other countries, that might be a non-starter. And the last on this list is domestic political pressures. And this is certainly more of an issue for governments that are receptive to domestic support. But fundamentally, I mean, especially again for the US, who's poured well over 100 billion into its national and other missile defense systems in their lifetime, we're left with a situation where actually it's very, very hard now to get US policymakers to backtrack on ballistic missile defense policy. Realistically, no US policymaker can now explain to the US public that after all this effort and all this money, the US policy should be to cut back on ballistic missile defense because it upsets the Chinese and the Russians. To the electorate in the USA, that is probably not very palatable and probably wouldn't go down. So this now leaves me with my concluding thoughts. And just to wrap up these questions in the presentation, because I'm aware we're tight on time. Firstly, these systems are not going anywhere. And we do have a very narrow window of opportunity to get the ball rolling with dialogue and risk mitigation here. That brings me to my second point, that actually we need to ask ourselves if the current international climate is really going to accommodate conversations on this. If we look at the events going on in the world right now, is it possible that in order to make progress on these issues, we should probably pay more attention to healing the kind of current or old wounds of the past? Third, and this thought is slightly more optimistic, it's that actually in risk mitigation can be unilateral, right? In terms of escalation, certain missile defense assets, particularly radars, have specific applications for nuclear early warning. And if we want to mitigate some of those risks of unintended escalation, we can take it upon ourselves to kind of disconnect or make systems more redundant. But again, that requires domestic political motivation, and I do fear that that is lacking at the moment. So I will leave that there. So all things, I will thank you very much for listening. I'm aware that was quite content heavy, and I'm aware that I do speak quite fast as well. But if you want me to elaborate on any of my thoughts or any of the kind of key concepts there, I'm more than happy to. Thank you very much for listening. Cheers.